Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Arizona Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan Steering Committee meeting number 5, September 27, 2018. Welcome once again to CAP headquarters. Note that on the first slide here, there is a link to access to the presentation materials on both the CAWCD and the ADWR website. Tom and I would like to thank everyone for coming today and spending time on this important work. Once again, we have a full house. Reminder for those of you who have not been here before, I guess it wouldn't be a reminder then. Bathrooms are down the hall to the right. There's snacks and water out on the table outside in the hall. Just wanted to let everybody know that we have some guests today. They are not in the room with us. They are over in the other building watching the meeting. They are 8th graders from Paulo Freire School in Tucson. They are studying water policy and water science, and they are watching us to see how water policy is done. So everybody, please behave, and let's make sure that they have an effective lesson, and we really do teach them how this is the right way to do this for these future water leaders, right? Formative little minds. Let's make sure we do our job. We'll have them come over toward the end of the meeting so they can be in the room. So let's get going. Tom will walk us through the agenda.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before we start with the agenda, I wanted to make sure folks see that along with the printed slides for today, we had an additional document. It was actually an action item. We had been asked to make sure that we include in presentations the intentionally created surplus creation, delivery, and annual or total accumulation volume limits, both without and with the drought contingency plan. And so, remembering too late this morning that we promised to put that in the presentations, we printed out a separate piece of paper for people's reference. Will help so that we don't have to continually answer the questions about what are the limits again. So, good document for reference. So again, our agenda for today, after we get through the welcome and introductions, we're going to give you a status of the Basin State process and the drought contingency plan documents, recapping the steering committee meeting 4, a report regarding the mitigation work group, a report about the Arizona ICS framework work group, your comments such as they weren't already made as we work through the slides and the presentations, and then prepping up next steps for the steering committee meeting number 6 on October 10th. So with that, let's go around the table and do quick introductions of the delegates. We'll start to my left.
Ted Cook, Central Arizona Project. Just remember, only 3 mics work at a time, so when you're done talking, please turn it off.
Lisa Lance, Office of the Solicitor, alternate for Leslie Myers.
Senator Lisa Otondo, and my alternate is Senator Andra D'Alessandro.
Representative Rusty Bowers, and my alternate is Representative David Cook.
Senator Gail Griffin, and my alternate is Jeff Cross.
Kip Volpe, Southern Arizona Leadership Council. I'm an alternate for Ted Maxwell.
Stephanie Smallhouse, Arizona Farm Bureau, and my alternate is Philip Bashaw.
Doug Dunham, Epcor Water Company, alternate for Joe Geisel.
Hunter Moore, Governor's Office.
Joe Olson, Metro Water District. My alternate is Wally Wilson.
Tim Tomier, Director of Tucson Water, and my alternate is Andrew Greenhill.
Paul Lorm, Pinell County Irrigators, and my alternate is Dan Jones.
Courtney McKinstry with the Arizona Chamber. I'm the alternate for Glenn Hammer.
Kevin Moran, EDF and Water for Arizona Coalition. I am the alternate for Ted Kowalski, Walton Family Foundation.
David Godleski, Southern Arizona Home Builders Association. My alternate is Dennis Rule.
Spencer Camps, Home Builders Association of Central Arizona. My alternate is Rob Anderson.
Laura Grignano, Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District, and my alternate is Perry Benamelis.
Lois Wakimoto, Mojave County Water Authority.
Shane Leonard, Maricopa County Ag, Roosevelt Water Conservation District, and my alternate is Brad Streeter.
Cheryl Lombard Valley Partnership. My alternate is John Graham with Sunbelt Holdings.
David Brown, Arizona Categories.
Cynthia Campbell for the City of Phoenix. I'm the alternate for Catherine Sorensen.
Wade Noble, Yuma.
Fred Schneider, Arizona Water Company. I'm the alternate for Bill Garfield.
Brian Wong, representing Pima County Agriculture. My alternate is John Kamik.
Dan Cotterman, City of Goodyear, alternate for Javier Sedovich.
Brian Biesmeyer, Scottsdale Water. My alternate is Kathy Rawl.
Virginia O'Connell, Arizona Water Banking Authority, and my alternate is Terry Surasi.
Sandy Favorites for Freeport.
Dennis Bass, Chairman, Colorado Tribes.
Karen Caesar, CAP Board, and my alternate is Mark Taylor.
Lisa Atkins, CAP Board, and my alternate is Jim Hallway.
Dave Roberts for Salt River Project, and my alternate is Chuck Podolak.
And Tom Boshotsky, Director of DWR, my alternate is Clint Chandler. So before we move to the next piece of the agenda, I wanted to read a tweet that I came across this morning, and it happens to be from the Southern Arizona Leadership Council, Ted Maxwell. It says, another drought contingency plan steering committee meeting today. Thanks to Doug Ducey, Ted Cook, and Director Tom Boshotsky for leading the effort to preserve and protect Arizona's water. Those involved, including Southern Arizona Voices, are making progress. And what a great tweet, and thanks for having sent that out. We can use these things as good momentum builders, I think. So it was great to see that this morning. So moving on to the agenda. Status of Basin State process and drought contingency plan documents. And we have a very important new element that came out of the meetings of the 7 basin states and the United States on September 18th, where we were discussing the process and the timing for the finalization of the documents. And that new item was pursuant to a discussion. We're looking at an addition to the drought contingency plan agreement to allow the parties to enter into separate implementation agreements with the agreement of all 3 states regarding drought contingency plan contributions and sharing of intentionally created ICS accumulation space. So an implementation agreement is being negotiated, driven by a need in California. This relates to the intra-California efforts to deliver DCP there. California and Nevada then would make an additional 50,000 acre-foot each contribution of their respective total intentionally created surplus accumulation limit available to Arizona. So we will get another 100,000 acre-feet of accumulation volume. We certainly heard a desire to do so at a couple of our meetings, our prior meetings. Nevada would then make up to 300,000 acre-feet of drought contingency contributions to satisfy California's DCP contribution obligations through the pendency of the Drought Contingency Plan 2026. California would repay the volumes of Drought Contingency Plan ICS that Nevada borrows under DCP up to the volume contributed for California. So Nevada will hold the ICS in its account. If California gets to a point, and essentially Metropolitan gets to a point where they've used up all their intentionally created surplus in making their contributions, which we like to call reductions, they would be able to toll this account that is held in Nevada's name, and it's intentionally created surplus that Nevada has created. And again, the reason for this is the potential impacts in California, and particularly on Metropolitan, if there is the serious state water project drought issues that they faced in the 2014-2015 time period. So we thought this was a creative way to deal with that issue. And we think the 100,000 acre feet can be extremely valuable to Arizona, as we discussed a couple of times previously, and looking at ways and thinking about ways to actually utilize that extra 100,000 acre feet. The last bullet then is very important. And Arizona will not agree to make contributions on behalf of another state under this provision of the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan Agreement without additional approval of the Arizona legislature beyond the joint resolution authorizing the director to approve the drought contingency plan. So if I get the joint resolution approved in the legislature to sign on to the DCP, that would be agreeing in principle to the Nevada, California sharing provisions, but it would not allow Arizona to enter into such an agreement with either Nevada or California without subsequent discussion and approval in front of the Arizona legislature. So that's a backstop for us in that we would have another opportunity, again, if we're going to help out a fellow state in dire need, to go back to the legislature to make sure we have the support in real time for that to happen. So we're not going to have a blanket approval up front for Arizona to enter into these agreements. So I want to stop here because this is really important to discuss this issue. And I'd like to hear from anyone that has questions or comments at this point in time. Representative Bowers.
In the general concept of sharing water with other states, I can understand a flexible need that we would hold, but would hope others would hold, in that we might need their water too. Obviously, the construct, how is that triggered? What is the end date? What makes it temporary versus permanent, et cetera, et cetera. That would all be part of the agreements that we would look at.
Yes, Representative Bowers, and I'll point out that when the interstate water banking program got put into place for Nevada, Arizona helping Nevada, there was certainly lots of public discussion and those sideboards and controls in state law regarding that program. And because of the importance of this and the issues you just raised, this is why we are not going to seek approval for the state to enter into those additional agreements, except for kind of a one time of each type of a situation, so that we can have that very discussion that you described.
Just a clarification. Tom said this, and it says it on the slides, just so everybody understands, this is a multi-step process. So the second bullet covers the fact that the DCP agreements among the states will allow two things to happen. One is the borrowing of accumulation space for ICS among the states. The other one is for one state to step in and satisfy the obligation for another state. However, both of those, activating either of those provisions under the DCP agreement would require a separate implementation agreement. And that's the subject then of this third bullet there. And what Tom is saying, other than this implementation agreement that's on the table right now, future ones would require additional approvals to occur. It's just that the DCP agreement allows that to happen, provided for this implementation discussion to take place. Nothing beyond this first agreement that's described under bullet 3 is being contemplated at this point in time.
So again, approval of DCP, the joint resolution at the legislature, would kick in the 100,000 acre foot space for Arizona through dependency of the drought contingency plan, and the implementation agreement between Nevada and California would then be effective as well. Just so everyone understands in a clear way that issue. So I know this is perhaps complicated, and it is something brand new. We did make it expressly clear to our Basin State counterparts that we needed to come back to Arizona, that our agreement in the Basin State meeting was contingent upon discussing this with the steering committee, the folks in Arizona, to assess their comfort level. So the sooner that we can have feedback back to the Basin States, the better that will be. They are furiously drafting paragraphs and language into the drought contingency plan itself and the implementation agreement. So I'm not seeing other folks who want to speak, but I'm going to take silence as, at least for this point in time, until you have more time to digest this a little bit, as at least at this point, tacit agreement that we will continue to work with the other states to make these provisions in the DCP and the implementation agreement happen. Does that sound reasonable? Seeing heads shake, so
Yes.
appreciate that.
Mike Curtis from the Zip Zone.
Mike?
Any congressional approval needed?
So again, the DCP itself and these provisions wouldn't become effective until congressional legislation is passed, and we talked about that earlier. So anyone else in the audience want to weigh in on this? Senator Griffin?
I think we need a lot more information on it, and I see that information following.
Okay. We'll move on. So we had lots of discussion at this meeting about the need for boards, commissions, et cetera, in various states and other public processes in various states to move forward regarding the drought contingency plan documents. And as we worked through that, we realized that the time that we need to complete the documents and the timing of daylighting those documents would not be yet for a couple of weeks. And we all agreed in the upper basin states and the lower basin states that the draft documents would be available on Reclamation's website on October 10th. And we all agreed not to provide those documents to any of our constituents until that point in time. Unfortunately for us, our next steering committee meeting is on October 10th, which means we will have to provide those documents to you at that point in time, more or less the same time when they're being posted on Reclamation's website. So we will beg your indulgence on that one, but it's the best date we could come up with that worked for all 7 states. So recapping from steering committee meeting number 4, we talked about and gave presentations on reviewing of the goals, objectives, and sideboards of the steering committee and our status at the halfway point. Updates on mitigation workgroup efforts, including mitigation concepts. We talked about an outline of the Arizona ICS framework concept that would accommodate tribal and non-tribal intentionally created surplus. The delegates asked us to continue working in the mitigation work group and supported the goal of completing this process by November 9th. Quick recap of the schedule then. Again, you can see the steering committee meetings, the 10th and 25th of October, the 9th, and we're still keeping the 29th on the calendar. Don't remove it from your calendars, but again, with the goal of getting done sooner than that.
So now we will move to a little bit more granular review of kind of where are we in the overall process. both the Mitigation Plan Work Group and the Arizona ICS Framework Work Group. Try to say that fast 5 times. And you may note that what began as Ag Mitigation Work Group is now we're just calling the Mitigation Plan Work Group, because as you will hear, those discussions have expanded beyond just ag mitigation. And likewise, with what began as a tribal ICS work group, those discussions have expanded into what we're now calling the Arizona ICS Framework Work Group. Those work groups are targeting providing recommendations to the steering committee at the next steering committee meeting 2 weeks from today on October 10th. Recommendations is the ideal, is the goal that we have to have the work in the work groups to the point where a recommendation can be made. If that does not happen, I think as far as a specific recommendation, in order to maintain our schedule, we would be considering some other type of handoff to the steering committee at that point to maintain our overall schedule. The other 2 essential elements of DCP that were identified at the beginning of the process, which is excess water and Arizona compensated conservation program discussion, are targeted for recommendations by October 25th. What we have said before is that we believe that many of the open questions or issues, considerations related to excess water and to a compensated conservation program will be part and parcel of whatever emerges from the Mitigation Plan Work Group and the Arizona ICS Framework Work Group, and whatever is left might well be able to be handled at the steering committee level. That would be our hope, rather than having to spin off a work group, because we don't frankly think that there will be much left. For instance, on excess water, there has been many side discussions with respect to that. There really won't be any, but one thing that remains to be discussed is turn back water during the year and how that is handled. If anybody else can think of other excess water issues or other compensated conservation program issues that might be remaining that are not being addressed by the other 2 work groups, those would be appropriate to bring forward at either October 10th, assuming there's room on that agenda to do that, or October 25th. We expect to have a total package, as Tom said, on November 9th. There is one additional meeting scheduled in late November that we're hoping to not have to do, because we'll be done, but it's there if we need it. We're not sure, at least I'm not sure, what does a total package look like, but I think it would be agreement in principle for how each of these individual programs work: the mitigation plan, the Arizona ICS framework, excess water, and compensated conservation, that there's enough detail to how those work, who's involved, where the resources are coming from, how it's being paid for, that this is something that we could come to consensus on at the steering committee level. In the alternative, we hope to be at least far enough along that we could have some kind of non-binding letter of support or non-binding resolution of this group or something like that. We brought this concept up for the first time on Monday at Tribal ICS number 3, and rightfully so. Lots of people said we need a lot more information before we get to the point of being able to do something like that, and Tom and I understand that. So we're going to explain a little bit about how do we get from here to there. I don't believe it says it on this slide or the next slide. Yeah, it does.
Can I interrupt you for just a sec?
Sure.
My schedule shows that November meeting's on the 8th.
You know what? Did we do that again? Let me check the calendar real quick. I think we made that mistake before. Yes, it is on the 8th. Indeed it is. So I don't know how, we must have copied an old slide or something. Yes, November 8th is the next to last meeting. November 29th, 3 weeks after that, is the last scheduled meeting.
Excuse me, I think that it may have been changed to the 9th because on the 8th is the governor's long-term water augmentation committee meeting.
So I recall requests to change it also because there's NWRA going on. We'll have to make sure we have the right date and see what we can do.
We will clarify that this afternoon by email to all the delegates and alternates, and post it on our websites to make sure that that's completely clear. And I apologize for the confusion. So back to the plan of, so how are we going to get from here to there with all of the work that needs to be done? The last bullet on this slide says that we, Tom and I, propose to have both. Let me back up from that. We will need at least one more ag mitigation work group meeting, or one more mitigation plan work group meeting, and one more Arizona ICS framework group meeting before we can proceed. But let me move to the next slide here in a second. So we suggest having those meetings actually to stack them up on October 10th, which is the day of the next steering committee meeting on the afternoon, and have 2 work group meetings in the morning. One from, so it's a long day, one from like 8 to 10 and one from like 10 to noon, an hour for lunch, and then come back and do the steering committee. The reason for that is, so this is a pretty drastic step, but the reason for that is that we are beginning to see lots of progress in the discussions, but as we get into more details, it takes more time. And so there are smaller side groups that have begun to work out some of the specific details behind how some of these programs will work. And you can see on this slide, those groups include Arizona legislative leaders, tribal reps, CAP M&I subcontractors, ag representatives, developers, and there are probably more on here. And while we've managed up to this point to kind of juggle steering committee meetings and 2 work groups, fitting this in while all of that's going on simultaneously has become very difficult. So the plan that I outlined on the previous page of having 3 meetings back-to-back on October 10th is to give us 2 solid weeks to have as many of these side meetings and flush out many of the details. And these include things that we're really hungry for, such as quantities of water that might be provided by someone. We need to have a discussion at some point about where does funding come from for these types of things. And that was the path forward that Tom and I and our staff saw, was to schedule things the way that we've just outlined here. And we will solidify the plans for those 2 work group meetings happening on the morning of October 10th as soon as we're done with this meeting. Our desire by taking this path is to refine available information on these elements of DCP, both water and financial and other, and build support for this joint resolution at the legislature and the intermediary step of coming out of this group with some kind of package, recommendation, joint resolution, something like that of our own, saying we have a plan and here it is, and we're all in consensus to move forward. Are there this is a lot of information. Any questions on any of that, other than it's going to be real hard? No. Okay. We'll have more time later for additional discussions. So let's get into a readout from the 2 work group meetings that have happened since the last steering committee meeting. The mitigation plan work group meeting met on September 19th. The group reviewed mitigation mechanics and refined mitigation tools. We'll show some of that to you all here in a second. One of the key things that we were asked to do going into that meeting was to begin to put some quantities to potential mitigation beyond the ag mitigation, such as for the NIA pool and also for the development CAGRD pool. So that's some of what we'll show you in a second. The work group reviewed mitigation impacts and mitigation recommendations for NIA and CAGRD developer supplies. We'll show that to you in a second. And refined the proposed full mitigation volumes for all CAP ag districts and for Pinal AMA CAP Ag districts. What that bullet is referring to is, you may recall that there were a number of questions that needed to be answered, such as full mitigation, partial mitigation. Would there be a framework or package type of mitigation that was set in advance, or would it be an annual process? Those are not fully discussed yet, but there was another one about is and how much mitigation needed in the Tucson AMA and the Phoenix AMA. And where we ended up with that was Brian Wong reported on behalf of his constituents that the Tucson AMA ag districts would not be requiring mitigation, and that in the this took a little effort, but in the Phoenix AMA, that only one district, I believe it's Queen Creek, required some mitigation. We also had an earlier question that we had answered previously about whether or not Harquahela, which is of course outside of our AMAs, would require mitigation, whether those numbers were included in the 106,000 acre feet that was identified by the Pinal Ag folks, and the answer was no. So that the total full mitigation quantity now for Tier 1 has been revised upward from 106 to some higher number, and I think we have that on a slide here in a minute. We'll show it to you. The work group set a goal. So those were important milestones to get those things clarified. But we have more questions to answer. The work group set a goal of bringing its findings forward to the steering committee at the October 10th meeting. Here's what I've been promising for the last 5 minutes that we'll show you in a minute, part of it. So once again, refined estimates of the mitigation tools. One of the things that we had been asked to do, in addition to identifying potential mitigation pool quantities for NIA and developers, was to put some meat on the bones in the lower part of this slide that has to do with additional quantities of water that might be available, in addition to what we had previously identified as firm. And this is just a label. It doesn't convey any particular attributes other than these are things that we think we either know about with certainty or we're pretty confident of. So again, what those three things are is Lake Pleasant. This is water that's in Lake Pleasant right now, that's accumulated over the last few years. It actually was higher than this at one point, and now it fluctuates. So we just happen to be a little bit ahead of the bubble on this one with what amount of water needs to be in the lake for operational purposes. It's about 50,000 acre feet, maybe a little bit more. Second category is CAP ICS. This is CAP is the only contractor in Arizona that has created ICS on behalf of Arizona so far, and that quantity of 420,000 acre feet includes about 300,000 that's been created to date, and another 120,000 acre feet that will be created this year and next year. And then this third, so this is water that's in Lake Mead already. And then a third category of compensated conservation for mitigation. The source of this has not been identified yet, but the conversations are ongoing. That's in the process of fleshing that out. And we believe that to be about 50,000 acre feet per year, or about 350,000 acre feet in total. And the ranges over on the right, either of cost per year or cost over the total program, ranges is between the cost that we've incurred in the past and what we think would probably be a reasonable number to assume for the next 7 years. We call those firm supplies. You can see that that's about 820,000 acre feet. It doesn't it's shown on as an annual amount, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those quantities would be needed to be used in that manner or in their entirety at all. It's just a way to kind of scope it. And then you can see what the total costs look like to the right. The other ones, now we put some numbers to, have been for new ICS, so emerging out of the ICS, Arizona ICS framework discussion. We'll get to more details on this in a little bit. The total amount of ICS capacity that would be available under DCP for Arizona would be 500,000 acre feet. And if this additional 100,000 that Tom mentioned earlier was available, it would be even more. But the premise of the discussion of that work group is that those quantities, those capacities would be split. So there would be 250,000 nominally available for tribal ICS, or 300, I guess, if there was a larger quantity. And what we've done is arbitrary, but assumed that if tribes are creating ICS, at least some of it will be created for the purpose of leaving it in Lake Mead for some period of time, because there obviously ICS is created and then it's recovered at a different point in time. So we've assumed that there would be a range of about none of it to about half of it might be a reasonable range to assume of what ICS might, a new ICS that could be created might be available for mitigation purposes. I'll say here, part of the discussion there was, well, if this conservation is being created for purposes of mitigation, it might make more sense just to create compensated conservation rather than going through the whole, jumping through the hoops of an exhibit and putting water in the lake and so on and so forth, and that may be true, but this gets back to a point we've discussed a lot here too, is that there's many things that can be done with conserved water, and the decisions that are made have consequences, and so those are considerations that a creator of conserved water would have to consider. And then also, we've discussed USF to GSF, where water is going to USFs now, mostly in Phoenix and Tucson AMA, and could some quantity of that be diverted to a GSF in Pinal County as part of mitigation for ag? There are lots of side conversations about that, the relative value of Pinal County long-term storage credits compared to storage credits in the other two AMAs, et cetera, who would need to be paid to incentivize them to do that, where would the money come from, but we have begun to scope what the approximate quantities are, and that we've had some information on that before in earlier steering committee meetings that was provided by the ag folks, range of 25 to 80,000 acre feet per year might be available there. Groundwater development and infrastructure, we have not put any quantities on here, even though the purpose of upgrading infrastructure would be to be able to pump more groundwater sooner, but we are not at the urging of the ag folks counting that in the same nature as CAP surface water. But we do have it on here as a what I will call, these are my words, a mitigation substitute. The $10 million that's listed there off to the right would be local matching that would be required on the order of magnitude of what type of federal programs have been available in the past for this type of funding. So it still needs a lot of development, but the total potential supplies that have been identified for mitigation for ag or other purposes would be somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million acre feet at a total cost of, we estimate, at least $80 million and potentially higher than that. So we've been through various versions and levels of this many times. Are there any questions before we move on? Tim?
Just more of a statement that regarding the USF to GSF option, Tucson is definitely interested in continuing that conversation, and I think there's a number of options that could lead to a volume that could actually promote that to the firm half of the chart, and for a variety of reasons I think it would also be a more palatable option than ICS and some of the other things that I think a lot of folks have expressed concerns about. So wanted to just express some support for that. I think there's a lot of merit to it. I think there's actual real water that could be flowing toward that option, and we're looking forward to discussing that, especially leading up to October 10th.
Okay, thanks, Tim. And that's a very important point, is that one of our goals here in having these discussions is to graduate the things that are in the non-firm category, the potential category, up to things where we consider that they're firm, that we can count on them, so that in aggregate there's enough of those in quantity and also in money that would go with that to be able to say we have a program. We can embark on the program. Maybe we don't have all the pieces, but we can at least get started without foundering later. Any other questions on this slide for now? Cynthia?
I just want to make that same statement on behalf of Phoenix, and some of the other valley cities have talked together, and there is water available to store in Pinal County. We also think there is a way to make the cities whole in terms of the credit issue without the expenditure of money. So we think that that's a very viable option, should probably move to the firm side of that ledger too. And we would also reiterate, we really don't like the idea of using ICS at a time when we're protecting Lake Mead to take water from Lake Mead. So that still poses a fairly significant problem from our perspective.
Well, those are mutually supporting goals there. If we develop these other supplies, then that can supplant the need to use some of the supplies that we'd like to conserve for one reason or another. And I might point out that that on that list of small group meetings that we need to continue to have and discussions, this is one of them that Tim and Cynthia just commented on. Paul?
I suppose just to clarify the record, we are certainly willing to consider options that would move the USF to GSF category to the firm status. But we're also continue to be very supportive of the use of the existing ICS and the amounts you've designated here. It's not a significant amount in light of the total amount of ICS that would be stored under a DCP program. And we feel that really is the baseline for meaningful agricultural mitigation. So we would not want to see that taken off the table or reduced in any way.
Okay, others? We'll move on then. Oh, Representative Bowers, sorry. Oh, Mr. Godlewski, thank you.
So I would agree with Paul's comment about keeping as many options on the table. We've obviously had some good discussions, and I think are starting to get to the meat of the issue. Looking at this slide, it seems like there's a lot of water that's potentially available. The key is going to be where the rubber hits the road and how we work through these. If the intent is to have kind of these one-off meetings with different stakeholders and bringing everybody together on the 10th for consensus and having the working group meetings in advance of this, I guess it's a question for Ted and Tom. When it comes to specific uses, whether it's for ag or GRD, at what point are we going to get into those deals or those discussions?
As soon as possible. Really, it's going to have to literally be organic. And the idea with the one of the things that we discussed with this kind of stacked meeting schedule on October 10th is that we can do a pretty good job of preparing for the 2 work group discussions. But out of necessity, since we won't know what the outcome of those are ahead of time, is that most of what will be done in the afternoon of the 10th for the steering committee, other than the discrete agenda topics like reviewing documents and things like that, will be a review of what happened that very morning. So we're hopeful that we can create some momentum in the work at the work group level and move that right into the steering committee as much as possible. We will have to see how that works. Representative Bowers, did you want to have Mr. Camp's comment?
Do I want to be in front of Mr. Camps?
Yes, that's a question.
I think I'll go first and see if I survive later. But to members all, the concerns of conserving Lake Mead and its water levels versus using tribal ICS for mitigation. When on the news the other day, I saw that Phoenix and SRP had agreed to put more water on the ground, and I didn't say anything about quantities, but to have that happening while we're trying to find water for mitigation, that is also a concern, and how we balance all that together is also equal to me.
Spencer?
I just had a kind of clarification question. The credits that Phoenix and Tucson were talking about, have those credits already been pledged to somebody?
No, and this is for surface water that has not yet been delivered, that has historically, at least in the past few years, been delivered to USFs in Phoenix or Tucson AMA that would be under these discussions delivered instead to GSFs in Pinal County to use for ag mitigation. And they would, by virtue of being a GSF delivery, create a long-term storage credit in Pinal County instead of in where the water is going today, which is Phoenix and Tucson AMA. Did I get that right, Cynthia?
Then, Mr. Chairman, was that part, or to Mr. Roberts or anybody else, is that one of the flexible capabilities of the agreements with you in Phoenix?
The agreement with Phoenix provides them with some capacity that we currently own at the Granite Reef Underground Storage Project that's currently in use and has been in use for many, many years. And it won't change unless there's a lack of water to put in it. The other component of it is to store water in our groundwater savings facility for use by our customers. And that facility operates on a periodic basis, and the agreement provides them with some capacity in there. They've already been using that. It just firms up that capacity.
The concern of mine came that in the report, that it's how they reported that in the times of incredible shortage, that this was an opportunity for water to be preserved. And I thought at the time, we're doing that already. Is this like behind? Are they behind the report as they tried to document it, et cetera?
When you speak to reporters about these types of things, they often don't get it exactly correct. And so this is one of those situations like that. When you give them the background on it, sometimes it gets in there and sometimes it doesn't. In this case, it didn't.
So I'll ask another question, Dave. So is a substantial part of that agreement going to make well recovery capacity available to Phoenix to extract credits that are already in the ground?
Yes, we entered into an agreement earlier this year that provided access to Phoenix to some of our well capacity in order for them to recover long-term storage credits that are currently in the ground. Yes.
Yeah, just a question related to this chart on mitigation, compensation, conservation. I wondered if there's anything to share or update the steering committee and audience on about the possible sources of water for that kind of mitigation.
Under the third line?
Yes.
The same types of water that have been available in the past. Compensated conservation. So this would be money is offered by somebody for to reduce consumption, and that could be in many different ways. It could be from reduced underground storage. It could be reduced from other types of conservation. And then those quantities would become available. So no, to specifically say, well, of this 50,000 acre feet a year, 10 is coming from these people and 5 is coming from them, and here's who's going to pay for it. No, that has not been fleshed out to that level yet. Okay, Spencer, again.
Yeah, I just, this credit issue, I don't think I'm smart enough to figure it out. So Phoenix or Tucson would store water in Pinal County to earn a credit that would be exchanged in Maricopa County in what manner?
That has not been completely worked out. But to the extent that there are, so let's just say, and we're kind of getting ahead of the work group just a little bit, but that's okay.
Well, there's going to be a lot of meetings on this side, so I want to understand it before
there
we
are.
go.
You're going to be in some of them, I'm sure. So if there is an existing entity that is delivering water to a USF, let's just say in Phoenix AMA today, that would be interested in delivering that same water in the future to a GSF in Pinal County and therefore earn a long-term storage credit in Pinal County versus a long-term storage credit in the Phoenix AMA. Some folks may only be interested in doing that if they could find another partner that might have a Phoenix AMA credit that they already own that they would be willing to exchange for whatever reason for a Pinal AMA credit. In the conversations that we've had, the owners of the hypothetical Phoenix AMA credit may want to be compensated for that in some manner because they're giving up a higher value credit, let's say, to them. There have also been discussions about finding a partner in the Pinal AMA that may be able to recover and deliver a credit and exchange that for other CAP surface water that could be delivered to replace the USF water. So there's a number of mechanisms here that could make that work, but all of it is, I'm interested to hear Ms. Campbell's idea. All of them I can think of require money for somebody, but it's a good discussion to be having. Want to get into that now? Yeah, go ahead.
Currently, CAWCD holds 268,000 credits in its name that were created and paid for with tax money some time ago. And those credits in the Phoenix AMA could be exchanged with credits that the cities would earn in the Pinal AMA in those GSFs at no additional cost. Unless CAWCD was to be compensated for the difference in the price, which of course, that's certainly a conversation that someone could have a conversation about. But we have yet to talk about funding for any of this. So I guess it's part of the funding discussion for various mitigation.
Thank you. So, Cynthia, I have a question for clarification purposes. Are the CAWCD credits that you just talked about replenishment credits or other than replenishment district credits?
They were credits that were originally state demonstration project credits. The CAWCD board has pledged them for purchase by the GRD at some point in time, but they are owned by CAWCD currently.
Laura, and then Spencer.
Sure. As Cynthia said, by board policy, those credits have been dedicated to the replenishment district, and we're talking about potential mitigation for the GRD, so I think it would be very important for us to be included in those discussions if that is part of the plan. And I have not been contacted about that yet.
And I guess just to lay that out, we look at those as being the equivalent to, or actually better than, ICS that the taxpayers have paid a lot of money to put into Lake Mead. And by using the credits as opposed to ICS, we're not going to damage Lake Mead. But as it is, if we're talking about emptying out our ICS account, there will be an impact on NIA users, and to the point where there might not be an NIA pool well within the time of the DCP. And if that is the case, that is the very water that the cities have to store. So it's a double whammy by taking out the ICS. You will kill the NIA pool, and that's assuming that they are agreeing to waive going into the NIA pool, but you will kill the NIA pool, and you also potentially have an impact on Lake Mead. There's a lot more discussion that could be had here, and I think that there's a lot of potential for an opportunity to get real water into Pinal County, which I understand is the purpose of ag mitigation.
I think having a conversation about, the impacts of the NIA pool and some of the points Cynthia made, I think is a valid conversation. I just want to echo what Laura said. I think we're trying to mitigate, at least, and obviously our concerns is to mitigate any potential cuts to economic development to ensure we grow through at least 2026. That's why we're passionate about the mitigation programs for the GRD. Because that is a piece of that puzzle, and any program that we would adopt through this, it would exacerbate the problem, I don't think is the direction we want to go. So if you have conversations on this issue, I think we would like to be included.
Okay, and just to repeat, part of this discussion about use of ICS as a resource for existing ICS as a resource for mitigation versus other supplies, to put that in context, if all, and we did talk about this at the work group, all of the 420,000 acre feet of ICS that's in Lake Mead is used. That's 5 feet in Lake Mead, which is nothing to take lightly. However, 420,000 acre feet over 7 years, while we will be in at least a tier 1 shortage, and Arizona will be taking cuts of 512,000 acre feet, less deliveries. While that is going on, just put that in perspective. So that needs to be part of that conversation as well. Paul.
Yeah, that was going to make a similar point. I also would make the point that much of that ICS could potentially be backfilled with tribal or on-river ICS. So the net reduction in ICS is not going to be that serious, and it's a gross overstatement to say that somehow this will completely negate the NIA pool.
So this is the fun that we're having in the work groups. For those of you who are not participating in them, yeah, you may want to spice up your life a little bit. We have a question from the audience.
Yes, I'm Dick Powell, City Councilman in Pasadena.
Okay, thank you for your comments. I just might point out that the representatives from the towns and cities that are here are CAP water subcontractors, and we have a representative of the major water users in Pinal County, agricultural users, which is the major use of water in Pinal County, is Mr. Paul Orm as a delegate.
We're very happy that Paul's representing that, but we also do other things besides agriculture now.
Yeah.
And we need to know what goes on with our water, what we can get, what we can't get, and we demand decisions. On the group here, we have a voice that needs to be heard, and we're shut out, we're frustrated.
Well, thank you. We're happy to see you here today. And for those of you who don't know, these meetings are open. They are recorded. They're televised and available for viewing online. Any other questions on this slide? Doug?
Yeah, Ted, I just would also like to point out there's 2 of the larger private utilities that serve the majority of the population in Pinal
Thank you.
also
Thank you.
at the table.
Which would be Epcor Water and American Water. Arizona Water, sorry. So on this slide, we'll move on. Okay, we've seen various iterations of this slide before. And I actually will start with the middle tranche here. I'm sorry you're getting such a healthy helping of Ted right now, but we'll turn it back to Tom here in another couple slides. What these numbers in the middle here refer to is what we call full mitigation for all three AMAs in the CAP service area. 150,000 acre feet during a Tier 1 shortage, 60,000 acre feet in a Tier 2 shortage, and both of those numbers were derived by the incremental impact on on non-Indian agriculture in the three AMAs between what would happen under the 2007 guidelines and what would happen under the DCP. By example, under a Tier 1 shortage in the 2007 guidelines, the ag pool would have approximately 50% supply, which is 150,000 acre feet, and under the guideline, under the DCP, no supply, and so the difference between those is the other half, which is about 150,000 acre feet. Likewise, under a Tier 2 shortage, the difference would be from about a 20% supply to none. So that's where the 60,000 acre foot number came from. However, we reported earlier this afternoon that one of the clarifications that was made in, or some of the clarifications that were made in the discussions in the work groups earlier were that the Tucson AMA ag districts would not require participation in the ag mitigation pool, and also that and also that only one irrigation district in the Phoenix AMA would require participation in the ag pool, and so that is what is represented down here at the bottom, which is annual Pinal, Harquahala Valley Irrigation and Drainage District and Queen Creek Irrigation District, full mitigation in Tier 1, 120,000 acre feet, full mitigation in Tier 2, 45,000 acre feet. And these numbers you may have seen before was 106,000, and that has been refined based on these clarifications now to 120 and 45. So two possible approaches to an ag mitigation program have been discussed. One of those is, the terminology we're using is a fixed schedule for ag mitigation that might be provided during Tier 1 and Tier 2 shortages. What we mean by a fixed schedule is that we would agree to some assumptions, whatever those might be, and that based on those assumptions, what the quantities of mitigation would be provided throughout the expected shortage period of 2020 to 2026, and know in advance that is what mitigation quantities would be provided. Of course, we'd have to do the work to define where the water is coming from and how it's getting paid for. One example of doing that would be, and I will point now to this line here, the Pinal, Harquahala, Queen Creek mitigation, full mitigation numbers. If we take the weighted average between the probability of a Tier 1 shortage and the probability of a Tier 2 shortage in every year and multiply each one of those shortage probabilities times the Tier 1 and Tier 2 quantities down here, the weighted average number appears here. So that would be one way to do that. Another way to do it that we haven't illustrated with numbers is to do something like assume that we'll be in Tier 1 for 4 years and then Tier 3 or Tier 2 for 3 years after that. That's the assumption we make in advance. We design our mitigation program like that and say this is what we're going to do in advance. So that's what we mean by a fixed mitigation schedule. There's probably other ways to do that. I'm sure there are. We could say it's going to be 10 every year because it's what we agreed to. It'll never happen, but that's just an example of something that could happen. The other approach besides fixed is an annual schedule where every year as part of the August 24-month study, presumably we'd identify what tier the river will be in of shortage in the upcoming year and make a determination then about whether or not Tier 1 shortage would be provided or Tier 2, depending on what tier the river is going to be in the following year. That's more flexible, but it's also less certain. But those are kind of the two endpoints of how it can be done. Decide in advance what you're going to do based on some assumptions you agree on, or go a year at a time, maybe agree on what the quantities would be, but the determination of which tier are you in would happen on a year-by-year basis. We need to clarify there would be no mitigation in a Tier 3 because there's no water available under either the guidelines or the DCP, and there would be no mitigation in a Tier 0 because there would be some supply that would be available without a shortage being declared. What else do we need to say on this slide? So all of these numbers that are being shown, I think this is the last thing I wanted to say, all of these numbers that are being shown on here is so-called full mitigation, meaning that the amount of mitigation that would be provided would be based on the entire incremental impact on the ag pool from DCP over the 2007 guidelines. There was a discussion about, well, should it be full mitigation? Should it be something else? There's lots of variables there. Where's the water coming from? Where's the money coming from, et cetera? But we have not had a full discussion on partial or full mitigation. I've heard several times coming from the ag rep that they are not going to be supportive of anything other than full. But that's a discussion we need to have. Paul, do you want to say your own words?
Yes, I just want to make it clear to everyone, I think everyone around the table probably understands this. In this context, full mitigation is half our water supply. It's not like we suffer no damage at all under a shortage. Full mitigation is half of what we've been receiving. So I think it's important that that context is understood. So when we say we don't want partial mitigation, it means we don't want less than half. That's a very difficult mountain for us to climb. And so what we're seeking is to be the same place under the DCP as we would be under the existing 2007 guidelines, and that's with half our agricultural water pool in a Tier 1 shortage.
Tom wanted me to point out that as we're laboriously going through the explanation of where these numbers were developed, how they've evolved and things like that, and there's 2 more pages of this type of stuff. When we get to slide 14, it will all come together as kind of where are we at with all of the pieces.
Excuse me.
There's a reward at the end. If you can consider that a reward. Yes, Senator Otondo.
Thank you. I just have a quick question. In the work group for ag mitigation, when we were discussing what groups would be included in the full mitigation, if I'm not mistaken, it was not only Pinal, HVIDD, we discussed Queen Creek, and I do believe there were 3 others in Maricopa County. Did we not include those in these numbers?
My recollection of the conversation was that those other 3 districts in the Phoenix AMA indicated that they would not need to participate in the ag mitigation program.
Okay.
Is that correct, Shane? It was your alternate that reported back to us on that.
So Brad just learned the importance of making sure he informs me. No, he was correct. We did not get anything back from the other 3 that we were looking at, Ms. Tondo, and to put kind of a blunt point on it, to the extent that they were to come out and say, no, we're not talking thousands of acre feet, we're talking a couple of hundred. I think you're referring to Chandler Heights, Citrus Irrigation District, and a couple of the smaller but no less important to their customers. But it's enough that, given how the numbers are going to fall out, if they were to come back and say, oops, we made a mistake, I'm certain we could handle it. But they've not given us an affirmative that, yes, they have to have it.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe that came up to approximately 16,000 acre feet.
With regards to, I presume you're also talking about, well, New Magma, I think we're going off a little bit of, to a certain extent, Paul's comments on that. The biggest one that might be in question would be Tonopah. And again, I think they were looking at it from the standpoint of the potential for coming back later. They believed that they could provide some assurances, depending on how the system falls out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to, maybe this won't help, but I hope it does. We had begun at the beginning of the discussion on ag mitigation of a number for just the Pinal County irrigation districts of 106,000 acre feet. Later, there was a discussion about, well, what about Harquahala? Wasn't that number like 14,000? It's more like 12. And then, so the difference of how do you get from 106 to 120 is 106 for Pinal, 12 for Harquahala, and 2 for the other districts in Phoenix AMA, approximately. Okay. We're going to move on to the next slide.
Just for the record, we did have that math, and Brad just did send to me to make sure that that was correct. So, as the engineer he is, he made sure that the logic was there.
That's better to depend on an engineer than my aging memory. Okay. Now moving on to the discussion that we had in the last ag work group meeting, or I'm sorry, mitigation work group meeting on potential mitigation for the non-Indian ag pool and the CAGRD and developer pool. To put this in perspective, this was a request that had come out of the previous ag mitigation meeting number 3. Can we put some numbers on these two? Because while the ag mitigation, I'm sorry, the ag pool in early shortage, tier 1 shortage is impacted first and the most, the NIA pool will also be implicated in a tier 1 shortage and implicated in a tier 2 shortage even more than the incremental reduction to the ag pool potentially. And so we put some numbers together for non-Indian ag pool mitigation, and also CAGRD and developer, even though CAGRD is likely to receive no water under either the 2007 guidelines or the DCP. There was some discussion about the need to avoid just a sudden cutoff of because of excess water is going away for the CAGRD and developer pool. So we put some numbers together. None of these represent full mitigation, particularly for the NIA pool. Not everyone is on the same page with respect to this. That one of the reasons for that is that NIA pool is typically owned by folks who also have higher priority water that is a beneficiary of having DCP in place by protecting lower elevations in Lake Mead. Anyways, it was a great conversation starter. Let me just put it that way. All around, I don't intend to repeat every comment that we received from everyone, but they fell into 2 general categories. The number is too high, or the number is too low. And depending on who it came from and which pool that they were referring to, but it was a good conversation to start the discussion. And we did not wind up even close to the number should be this instead of that, and we need to continue those discussions. One of the topics that was brought up here earlier today, just so people understand, is brought up by Ms. Campbell, was that because the NIA pool will be reduced in a tier 1 and a tier 2 shortage, that any water that is conserved for ag mitigation purposes or for creation of ICS, even by higher priority water users, is subject to being ordered by pools that are being cut back, including the NIA pool. And one of the suggestions was, coming from the co-chairs, to consider that if water was being created, just conserved for an ag mitigation pool or a tribal ICS pool or any other purpose, that we would be asking for waivers from folks who had the right to order that conserved water under their contracts in order to allow those programs to proceed as designed. And rather than ordering that water, to waive doing so and take instead a portion of NIA mitigation. That conversation is not over yet. Not everyone agrees with that construct, but we need to have more conversation about it. So I don't know if there are questions or comments on any of this. Is a very compact readout from the discussions that we had at the last mitigation work group meeting. Anyone? David?
Thank you. We're obviously in the the numbers too low camp. I think it was again a good discussion. The one thing I think it's important to bring up that was discussed extensively at the work group meeting is while this particular topic of mitigation is referred to as GRD or developer pool, we're really talking about water for economic development and the importance of a healthy economy for the state of Arizona. The GRD areas produce about $14 million of economic development on an annual basis. And we think it's important that whatever plan we come to includes water for economic development. Our estimates is the water is certainly closer to somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 acre feet a year.
Yeah, that's just what I was going to ask. Okay. Brian.
Yeah, thank you. I'd also point out, and I understand the comment on economic development, but I would also state that there's water in other areas that is also involved in economic development, and cutbacks of that water have also significant economic development. So in that light, also in the cities as well. Just a point of order that it's felt all over the place when water is cut back.
Understanding that lots of work still needs to be done, both on the supply side, what water supplies are available to be available for mitigation purposes, and what the mitigation numbers ought to be, fixed, partial, full mitigation, full mitigation, partial mitigation, fixed schedule, annual schedule. What this slide represents, and there have been many iterations of this one too, is the vertical bars represent the potential supplies of water available for mitigation that showed up on slide number. Now, of course, I can't find it. 10. The blue bars at the bottom are what we consider to be the so-called firm supplies. The dark gray color in the middle is the lower range for the potential supplies, the two that we talked about today, USF to GSF, and also new ICS. And then the top gray section there is the upper range of the other potential supplies, those two, USF and ICS. And we've laid on top of that the three mitigation quantities. This is based on the fixed mitigation quantities using the weighted average of Tier 1 and Tier 2 probabilities. The green line is ag mitigation, full mitigation for Pinal, Harquahala, and Queen Creek. And then the orange dash line is the NIA mitigation, calculated the same way. And the dash line at the top would be the developer mitigation. Understanding all of these numbers need refinement. But to me, at least, this shows that we have the makings of a program, that the numbers are not so far out of bounds that there's a gap we can't close. That's just where I'm at personally. Any questions on? Well, one other comment that I will make. So the point that we talked about earlier is that the more we can develop supplies up here in the top part of the graph, the less necessarily that we need to use of these. But that has to happen for this to happen. And we might actually see, rather than these peanut butter application of these things across the board, more of some up front and more of other out further in time as those supplies are developed. And that needs to be a part of the discussion that we have here once we get a little further along on this, is how do we want to deploy the resources to make these programs happen. But to get to our finish line of joint legislative action in January, we're all going to need to get comfortable enough or not to recommend. We're certain enough to start doing this, and with some confidence that it is going to be sustainable for this period of time, one way or the other. Any comments, Tom? Anybody else? Sandy?
Going on for this one and for slide 10, one other supply that has come up from time to time, either tangentially or even obviously, is the replenishment reserve. And I know that's that's a volume of water that's sitting out there, but it was created during the Governor's Water Management Commission for the purpose of offsetting shortages to the GRD, either in times of shortage or system disruption. So I don't know what the volume is of that supply that's been stored and how that's broken up by each AMA, but I think that needs to also be
created for shortages to replenish the GRD and when we don't have available supplies, right?
correct. Yeah, so for that GRD volume, or for whatever portion of that is the GRD, at least some of that replenishment reserve needs to be at least looked at. I'm just saying we need to put it on the table as a possible supply.
For the GRD's mitigation or for other mitigation?
For the GRD's mitigation.
Okay, thank you
yeah.
for clarifying.
Yeah.
You know, we're happy to talk about the replenishment reserve. We've been talking about that for a year and a half, but, you know, we need to be careful here. You know, the reserve's kind of like using your credit card to buy a house. You know, it's a one-time use of those credits. Obviously, if we modified the replenishment reserve and that standard to kind of and use whatever's left over to cushion the impacts of a loss of water, we get that. But we don't want to, it's a finite use of that water supply to cushion temporarily any blow. It's not a long-term supply. And I know you know that, Sandy, but I just wanted to say that for everybody else. But I also want to just touch on, it's kind of interesting that the major discussion points seem to be geared towards depleting the use of the GRD. We talked about the credit issue. The replenishment reserve's now up again for discussion. It's just kind of an interesting take of a meeting for that to happen. And, you know, obviously from our perspective, we're trying to ensure that a message is sent when DCP is adopted on a national level that our water problems are over and corporations can invest in the state of Arizona. And I just, you know, I gotta put this out there because I think it's really interesting that the last couple major concepts we're talking about are solely at dealing with the GRDs and its supplies rather than assisting the GRD as it relates to the economic activity that takes place in the three-county service area. And I just want to footnote that. We want to have a rational discussion about this. We want to have a good discussion and productive discussion, and we hope that continues so we can do what's right for Arizona as it relates to adopting DCP, which is protecting priority users and protecting the levels of Lake Mead to ensure that we have a consistent and we have certainty and a message for the nation and every corporation that at least I represent that we've got water to grow.
Cheryl, yes.
So thank you, Sandy, for bringing up the replenishment reserve. I think what would be helpful as the next step for, I'll say, CAGRD, the home builders, developers, sit with City of Phoenix, and if Scott still wants to come, we talk about the replenishment reserve, we talk about the number that's out there for development, we talk about this credit issue. I think that would be the most fruitful way to be constructive.
Being facetious. Are you going to take the action to
I will.
get that group together? Thank you. Okay. Shane.
At the risk of seeming to argue with Spencer, I don't know that anyone in this group was looking at this process as a way to somehow send the message that if the GRD was somehow reduced in its ability to meet its demands, nor do I think that's the purpose, that somehow that would equate to Arizona not being viable for development. I appreciate the footnote, but I also appreciate that one of the things that this committee was intended to do was to recognize that water is, to a certain extent, necessary for everything we do, and to focus it into the areas that we can. So while I appreciate the comment, I want to make sure we don't send a false sense of panic through this entire process that somehow we're going to somehow derail the ability to do economic development in Pinal County if the GRD has a reduction in available supplies, no different than any of the other industries that are represented here. So if that's the message that's been passed, then apparently we all need to do a much better job of making sure that we've countered that. But I've not, at least from my limited view, taken anything that we've done in these meetings, either through the mitigation process, ICS steering, that somehow this conversation was related to reducing somebody's economic development ability. I just want to make sure that's in the record.
Go ahead.
Well, and I don't expect everybody to understand that, but we have sent that message. You know, there has been national media coverage on Lake Mead. That's totally appropriate, not knocking it. But the consequence of that message is that corporate offices of people that I represent call and say, we're doing our 5-year plan. How's Arizona look for water? And so when you get those calls, not the mere fact of what the decision they make, pro and con on the state of Arizona, but the mere fact you're getting those phone calls puts Arizona on the map as a decision-making factor of whether they invest in California or Colorado or Texas. And that's what concerns me. And my goal, and I don't think anybody disagrees with this goal, is to send a message out of this process that Arizona is open for business. We have a certainty amount of supplies, at least through 2026, for development to happen throughout the Sun Corridor. And I mean Pinal County, but I mean Pima County, where every home since 2001 has been a member, new home build has been a member of the GRD. I'm talking about the West Valley, where every subdivision that I'm aware of approved in the last 10 decades has been a member of the GRD. And those kind of messages are what, and maybe I'm the lone wolf, I don't think I am, but that kind of message needs to be sent when we're done with this process, that there is certainty there for corporations to make the investments that they so desire in the state of Arizona. We're no different than any other state.
Anything else? We're promising a break after the next slide. How's that? So here's where it all comes together. That a half an hour ago or so, 40 minutes ago, we said we are coming to a conclusion, at least on this piece of today's briefing. So where are we on mitigation plan, on all the decisions that need to be made? Annual versus fixed. We've heard from the ag interest, and some others have supported a fixed approach. I think certainty and enforceability are the two bywords there from at least the ag interest, that the fixed approach will give to them to know in advance what the quantities are going to be all the way through 2026. However, full consensus on this approach has not been reached yet. As I reported earlier, number 2 there, the 3 AMAs versus Pinal plus HVIDD mitigation, that we have solidified what those numbers are, but whether or not the consensus is to provide full mitigation or partial mitigation, which is actually the next one, has not been reached yet. There was a suggestion, as noted here, that only Tier 1 mitigation quantities be agreed to. I'm not sure I understood how that would work. Would that be for the whole period? Would that be for some, just as long as the Tier 1 was in place? But that just illustrates that this conversation of full versus partial has not yet been completely discussed. In that vein, alternatives to full mitigation to achieve a full mitigation package. Now, this would be for things like infrastructure financing, to accelerate the increase in use of groundwater that, as I said before, has been characterized by the ag folks as not being the same thing as access to CAP surface water, but it might be a substitute for that in a full mitigation package. No alternative has been brought forward other than the possibility of exploring federal funding that would require some matching for infrastructure development. There are other questions that have been raised in the small groups that we will continue to address, including things like or how are these volumes calculated, and are these the right numbers? I personally think we move beyond that, but we will continue to have those discussions until everybody is satisfied that we've discussed it enough. Number 4, mitigation to NI and CHRD developer impacts. I think everybody experienced firsthand what that conversation has looked like here in the last little bit. The support there is support for the concept from some parties. As I mentioned earlier, this concept of offering mitigation for the NIA pool versus a waiver is not completely agreed to at all, I guess, by some folks. And the developers, as we learned this afternoon, have stated that the numbers that have been proposed for development mitigation are too low. So we have work to do on that one. Support for water and funding commitments. We're making some progress on the water side. We've actually, Tom and I got a number of letters from folks. We won't at this point name names because we need to give them the courtesy of having a chat with them first, who are saying, hey, we'd like to talk to you about something we think that our organization might be able to do to participate, and this is the type of thing that needs to happen. We do need to carve out a specific time, I think, to have some conversation about potential funding with those parties. As mentioned earlier, the work group, the mitigation plan work group is working toward a recommendation in the steering committee on October 10th. If we can achieve that or get as close as possible by stacking the work group meeting right ahead of the steering committee, we'll get as far along that path as we possibly can. So any questions on where we're at and where we need to go on the mitigation plan discussion? No. Okay, did the pieces leading up to this page kind of make sense? More or less? Okay, thank you. So with no further questions, we're about, yes. Representative Cook.
On number 1 here on that slide, could you just explain that where it says on the support for fixed approach, the full consensus was not reached? Can you just talk about that for a minute, what exactly that means?
And I'll let them speak for themselves, but the non-Indian ag representatives have said pretty emphatically that they desire I guess desire may not even be a strong enough word, desire the fixed approach because of the certainty that's available to there to say, here's what the quantities are going to be each year between 2020 and 2026, however that's arrived at. Other folks have said, well, we're not so sure. We need more information about the quantities of water that are available, what's going to be used, and how much money it's going to cost, and where that's coming from, until we can either throw in with that point of view or make a case for annual. I don't think anybody is enthusiastic about annual because of the uncertainty, but without knowing, getting enough confidence that the fixed is going to work for 7 years in a row, that I think is why it's my perception of why there's some hesitancy to support the fixed at this point in time. If anybody has a different take on that, you're welcome to. Okay, thanks. So we're about an hour and 45 minutes or two, into our time. We'll have a, let's say, 10-minute break. That we'll try to keep that to 15 at the end of it. Please come back no later than 5 of 3.
Thanks, everyone. So we're going to move on to the report out from the Arizona ICS work group, meeting number 3. We did meet on September 24th. The work group discussed Generally, the intentionally created surplus mechanics, and again, we have this extra handout showing the annual creation, accumulation, and delivery capacities under the guidelines, and then under the guidelines plus the DCP as a reference document. The Bureau of Reclamation at that meeting provided additional details on how ICS creation works, what their role is in the certification and accounting, and that was done by Steve Inden, who came down from Boulder City to share that information with us. One of the things that we let the work group members know is that on Reclamation's website, that the existing exhibits under the existing intentionally created surplus program, so exhibits from all 3 states, Arizona, California, Nevada, are on their website. We are putting, if it's not already on there, a link, the address, on both CWCD and DWR's website. I have the link in front of me, the address, but it's 5 times longer than my name. But if you would like, I can read you the link, or you can look on our website and address it. So the reason we did that is because it will help folks understand what those exhibits entail and what kind of projects are eligible for intentionally created surplus. Also reminding folks that those types of exhibits and projects, especially the projects, are what would, in almost all cases, if not all cases, also qualify if system conservation was being done, either the traditional system conservation for the water to remain in Lake Mead, as we've done historically, or this concept of mitigation or conservation for mitigation for agriculture. So it would be very important and I think valuable for folks to look at that when they had a chance, those different exhibits. We talked about posting them all on our websites, but it's just too much paper to put on our website. So again, unless somebody is dying right now to hear the link address, we'll let you all access that address through our websites. So when we had our discussion about the parameters of the Arizona ICS work group, essentially what the Arizona framework, which would be the document memorializing what I'm about to say, we're basically going to split 50-50 the creation volume, the delivery volume, and the total accumulation volume. So the annual creation volume, the annual delivery volume, and the total accumulation volume would essentially be split 50-50 between a tribal and a non-tribal program in Arizona. Complications, which are several, are, as Ted has told this group many times, and the work group we've told many times, CWCD has and is in process through the end of 2019 of creating ICS that would take up more than half of the 250,000 acre foot total accumulation volume for Arizona. But CWCD's proposal, which the staff have supported, and of course all of these things, everything that's going on here is still subject to approval by the board members of CWCD. But at the staff level, the proposal was that if a tribal contractor wanted to create intentionally created surplus in a given year, that CWCD would take delivery of a volume of ICS that's already existing to allow that tribal contractor to have that capacity up to 250,000 acre feet on the tribal side to make that happen. So that was a very generous offer and creative way of sharing the ICS capacity in Arizona between tribal and non-tribal, and dealing with the fact that CWCD to date has been the only entity to create ICS and will be over the 250,000 acre foot total accumulation volume. So I think there was a lot of interest expressed in the discussion about, from the tribal interests, about going down this path with us. They all wanted to see more details. The details are going to be worked out in an Arizona ICS framework agreement. We hope to have a draft of that available for folks to review very soon. We're actually working on that this morning, working with CAWCD and Reclamation on putting that framework together, because those three entities are necessary parties to that agreement. In the discussion of this tribal ICS program, it also did come up, and we had some discussion about this already, about this issue of how much water should we be taking out of Lake Mead from the ICS category to achieve the mitigation package that we all, I think, support conceptually, but know that there's a lot of difficulties in how we're going to balance those different potential tools that are in the table that Ted has gone through, and we've gone through several times now. So there was definitely concern raised about, the cross purposes potentially of taking ICS out of the lake at the same time that what we're trying to accomplish with DCP and the tools that attach to DCP throughout all three states is increasing the elevation and protecting the elevations of Lake Mead. So from my perspective, I think there is a balancing act that can work there. And I heard, Paul, you say earlier that you think the 420 tribal ICS or total ICS coming out of the lake is what you would prefer, if that's the right way to describe what you said. But from my perspective, if we can come up with a package that's balancing the different tools that we have, the different firm and yet to be firm items on the list, in a way that creates that certainty that the mitigation is actually going to happen because we have water in hand, I would hope that folks would consider that as a successful outcome. And again, balancing, trying to protect the lake elevations, and balancing the need to have the certainty for however we mitigate all of the different sectors, as we talked about earlier in this presentation. We do have a goal for the work group of bringing recommendations forward to the steering committee of October 10th. We understand that to achieve that goal, there'll be a need to review and better understand, comment, edit, potentially, et cetera, the Arizona Framework Agreement. In relation to the non-tribal part of the 50-50 split, again, CWCD has already populated that part for the non-tribal in Arizona. We did have a meeting with some folks from non-tribal entities on the river. We talked a little bit about them, with them, about what the ICS program itself entails, how the exhibits work. And again, for folks who might not understand this, the exhibit that gets approved, that DWR offers, so to speak, to the other states so that they would eventually accept the exhibit, and the forbearance by California and Nevada would occur in a way that we would ensure that surplus, the intentionally herd surplus, comes back to the creator in Arizona. That exhibit can set up a series of projects. Just submitting the exhibit and having it approved doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to do those projects in any given year. So it's a menu, so to speak, of projects. So there's value in potentially getting exhibits that have these different menus of projects. The one who might pull the string, pull the trigger on a project is going to have different abilities and access to those projects in different years. I think we've seen that happen already. So, and I bring up this the importance of these exhibits because one of the things that will happen when the drought contingency plan is approved among the three states is that there will be a pile of pending exhibits to add to the already approved exhibits that will be signed off on all at once. And so there's an opportunity there to get some more exhibits in on behalf of Arizona entities. That's not to say that out into the future, additional exhibits won't be approved between the states, but this is an opportunity to get those approved in kind of one big package, while we are one big happy family collaboratively signing off on DCP. So we had a good discussion about that, both in the group and with the folks, the non-tribal folks on River, and I think some of them are considering potentially participating or putting exhibits together. So I also want to make the point that the Arizona Framework Agreement is about the creation volume, the delivery volume, and the total accumulation volume. It is not intended to determine what the disposition of the ICS created is in terms of the Arizona framework. That's for discussion again in this package of how we deal with elevations of the lake, mitigation, the whole 9 yards that we already talked about. So I want to make sure people understand that issue, so there's no misunderstanding that perhaps this framework agreement is going to dictate or propose the outcome of what's actually going to happen once the ICS is created. Again, that's going to be up to the entity holding the ICS in terms of how they want to participate or not in achieving the mitigation package necessary to deliver the drought contingency plan. Again, knowing that without the drought contingency plan, we'll only have 300,000 acre feet of accumulation volume, and there won't be much opportunity for additional folks to participate in intentionally created surplus, neither in the tribal side nor in the non-tribal side. So again, one of the huge benefits, 500,000 with this new proposal on the table, 600,000, essentially doubling our accumulation volume. So I'll ask for questions, or any of the work group members want to add comments. Chairman Manuel, your mic's on. Do you want to have a comment or a question?
Well, in fact, I missed the last meeting on that ICS work group, but I understand that Josh was here, so maybe he can have some comments on that. So, Josh, are you here?
Yeah, having been at the last few tribal, intentionally created surplus work group meetings, I don't know if this is necessarily going to come up, but there was some concern. I think the biggest concern from the tribal entities was the change in the ability to use that tribal ICS water off reservation. We had found that out at the last meeting, that was indeed going to be the case, and I mean it severely hamstrings any benefit the nation would get out of that water. And I know there's going to be further discussions on that, but that was just probably our largest concern. And I know some of the other tribal parties at that meeting also voiced that same concern.
So again, that's the issue of when a tribe creates ICS, what can they do with it once it's delivered? Does it have to be delivered back only to the reservation? To describe in a shorthand way what that issue is. And as Josh said, there needs to be more discussion among the parties here to the framework agreement, DWR, CWCD, and Reclamation, but also with the tribal representatives. And we are teeing up a time to do that, try to move that issue forward. Any others? Questions or comments? All right. Seeing none, we'll move on to the next slide. So Ted went through this slide in great detail already. I'm not sure there's a need to go through this again. But again, this slide is teed up and has been teed up to reflect two things: what we see kind of as firm right now, and knowing that mitigation compensated conservation has a big dollar amount tied to it, and we have not yet identified the funding to make that happen. So the firm word here, I think, relates to what has happened in the past with system conservation in terms of folks coming forward wanting to participate in that program, both in volume and price. And I think that's why we have that in the firm category. And then we've had plenty of discussion about the other ICS and the other things on the list. And we heard today possibility of getting further down the line on things like USF to GSF in a way that we might be able to move those up into the firm category. But from my perspective, when we get to the point where we actually have a package, we have water, it has certainty, that's all going to be firm. It has to be to give the certainty to the recipients of the mitigation water, in my opinion. Go ahead. So moving on to our approach to achieving the consensus recommendations we're seeking for October 10th. And you heard probably some of this already. DWR and CWC intend to meet with the small groups and key stakeholders over the next 2 weeks to obtain additional input to frame those initial recommendations. Cheryl volunteered to have a work group, I'll call it, or an ad hoc group, I'll call it, whatever, on these issues revolving around developer, home builder, GRD, mitigation, USF, GSF, et cetera. So thanks, Cheryl. And we'll try to coalesce all of this as best we can on October 10th. And again, we just put a list of groups that need to be involved. Again, the legislative leaders, tribal reps, M&I and NIA subcontractors, ag reps, developer interests, reclamation, which basically is this whole room. But in smaller chunks to make it workable, because I can't eat as much as I used to. So, desire to refine available information on mitigation and ICS tools and resources, both water and financial. We talked about the need to build that package. And again, to finalize the appropriate agreement to get to this non-binding letter of support and commitment idea, and maybe to have a little bit more discussion of that. In a perfect world, by the time we say yay to the DCP, we would have every agreement written by lawyers in lawyerese with every T crossed and I dotted. And we'd like to get there in November, but if we can't, we still think we need a strong way to have people express their support and express a way that they can say, yes, there's this package, it's good, we support it. We know there's more work to be done in terms of the legalese language to make it all happen. But the sooner we can get express support on a consensus basis for that package, I think the better. So we have this concept of a non-binding letter of support and commitment along the lines of the delegates, support the package that's put together, the implementation package for DCP, the Intra-Arizona implementation package, in a way that they're willing to recommend approval or support of, depending on what organization you are, of that package to their principals, to their organizations, to their boards, whatever they are. And this is a tool that has been used in the past to get Indian water rights settlements introduced in Congress before everyone has been able to go through the approval process of actually signing off on this settlement agreement. So again, it would be non-binding, but it's a strong commitment, at least by the delegates, that they think this package is at a point where they can advocate for it in front of their governing bodies and boards and constituency groups. So any questions about that concept? And again, as Ted indicated earlier, we had a discussion in the work group about the need to have a lot more meat on the bones on a lot of these things before we could get close to that outcome of the non-binding letter of support. So we are at a point of having heard many comments from the delegates to date. We're ready for additional comments, and I see Supervisor Wakamoto.
I made a statement at the last small group meeting, and I needed to clarify that because I've spoken to some of the other delegates that were a little confused about what I said. And what I said was that Mojave County Water Authority looks forward to the opportunity to create non-tribal ICS to protect Lake Mead and the river systems, and we support the DCP framework as presented, and we understand ICS to be used by the entity that created, and I'm talking about non-tribal ICS and not tribal ICS, that created it, and we have concerns about any deviation from the framework which result in the transfer of water to central Arizona. We also understand that some interests want to create ICS in Lake Mead and move the water to in part to central Arizona. We remain concerned that any transfer of Colorado River water from the river counties to central Arizona will have an adverse economic and environmental effect on the river counties. We are acutely aware that the 164,000 acre feet of fourth priority water reserved to the river counties is only 1/10 of the fourth priority water made available to central Arizona. We look forward to the development of tribal ICS and non-tribal ICS program by the steering committee, and we will continue to have the river county's best interests as as our foremost public policy goal. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that the steering committee understood that I was not talking about tribal ICS.
Thank you. Other folks like to comment, or David?
Just a question related to the small group meetings as they play out over the next several days. Are those all, and is the intent that those are all coordinated by individual steering committee members? Is there going to be coordination by CAP or DWR? And I would certainly ask that developer interest be a part of any of the groups where there's discussion about GRD.
So the genesis of these is really in two directions. Partly the genesis in some cases is where members of or delegates and their constituencies contacted us about wanting to talk about some of their ideas, flesh them out a little before they potentially got thrown out onto the table in a work group or steering committee. And then some of it has been DWR reclamation and CAWCD recognizing the need to reach out to certain groups on things like the Arizona Framework Agreement for Tribal ICS and other things for exactly the same reason, that we wanted to make sure what we were throwing out there had some transparency before we did, and that at least it wasn't a totally crazy idea from our standpoint. So certainly we think we have a pretty good handle on which constituent groups need to be involved in which discussions. I feel at least for the discussions that have been requested by stakeholders to DWR, that those folks, since it's kind of their meeting, their request, the request to be part of the meeting should go to them. But we will keep in mind from our perspective in any meeting that we call or create, that if there are GRD issues, developer home builder issues, we'd have you guys there in those meetings. So it's all, so I know Ted might want to add some things there.
So I think hopefully it's clear from Tom's answer. That can work either way, or a way we haven't even thought of, whether it originates from the delegates or their constituencies, or whether it's something that we think of, or our staff, hey, we need to talk to those folks or those folks. At the end of the day, we need to be involved at some point as ideas are introduced into here, so make sure that we can coordinate it with what else we're trying to do. And so far, that's worked fine. Except, David, you're probably thinking, how come I'm not in a meeting yet? Well, we'll get to that.
Shane?
I defer to Ms. Otondo first.
Thank you, Shane. So I just wanted to verify the days of the working group. So right now, we've scheduled October 10th from 8 to 10, and the other work group from 10 to 12. Do we know which working group is which? Because I'm doing both, but just perhaps for the members of the steering committee?
I think we'll just say, Senator, mitigation first,
Mitigation first.
ICS second.
And, okay.
Yeah, so 8 to 10.
Makes sense.
Mitigation, 10 to 12, ICS.
Thank you. And also, I'd like to ask Cheryl, when you do your working group, will you contact me? I'd love to be a part of that too, just to be in the room. Thank you.
Happy to.
And for ease, since the steering committee meeting will be here in the afternoon, we'll do those here as well, so people don't have to traipse around the valley.
And if I might, as long as we're on schedule, I'm sorry to interrupt the delegates. We have a clarification on the November meeting date. It's the 8th. We made a mistake on the slide today. It's the 8th. That's what all of your invitations are the 8th. It should be on your calendar as the 8th. It's on our website as the 8th. So apologize again for that miscommunication.
If I'm I'm sorry, go ahead. A couple of things. I think the young folks that you mentioned earlier might be sitting outside. Is that them?
Well, I have something for them, just
Oh,
once
okay.
the delegates are done.
Well, then we'll make this quick. First, I think it's pretty apparent that for the November 8th meeting, I'm going to just have it in San Diego. Well, did they join NWRA again? A couple of things. Number one, I really want to express, I think, the positives that came out of this meeting, and we could list them, but I wanted to say that I'm happy to hear that in particular Phoenix and Tucson are in essence doing what they had asked all of us to do, which is to step up and say, here's a way we can do things. I think that's fantastic. Second, for those of you who may not be aware, RWCD did deliver a letter to DWR and to CAP indicating in writing our relinquishment of our entitlement of ag pool water for purposes of mitigation, and then as the group might see fit moving down. My expectation is with Brad's great efforts that you'll be beginning to receive those same letters from the remaining Maricopa County Ag Forbearance 3 districts. So again, I want to make sure that we understand that there are some good positives, particularly here today, and so I want to say that. The other is that my board remains committed to the process, at least in as much as I've been able to meet with them. So if at the November board meeting I'm not here, that means they probably didn't like what I had to say. But the district is in a position, particularly because of its location and then its facilities, to help potentially facilitate recovery opportunities. And I wanted to make sure that we put that out there, similar to what we discussed with EPCOR and others. And so as we're coalescing these ideas, I know that that seems to be the other side of the coin that we need to get to, but RWCD would reiterate its commitment to not only that, but if there's something else that might be done, we're here to help as well. So again, thank you for everybody's time and allowing us to be a participant.
Thanks, Shane. I appreciate, we did receive your letter, and I appreciate very much the flexibility that you're willing to create for us as part of this work, as part of this steering committee to help make this all happen. Any other delegates? Delegates. Seeing none. Can the students out there hear me? Can the students out there hear me? Are they going to come in? So while they're coming in, I will share that back in the day when I worked for Phoenix, there were times when I took my daughters on Take Your Daughter to Work Day to city council or subcommittee meetings, and Councilman Maddox would always call on them to speak and terrify them. Nevertheless, perhaps we have time in our
No pressure, guys. Speak up.
can turn it. Would you mind if I ask one of your questions on your behalf? Okay. Okay, so there's a leader right there, right? So this one, I think this is an awesome question. They all are, but this one particularly for this group. What is the plan if we get below Tier 3 shortage?
Good question.
No showers for a week.
So I'll take a shot at answering that. And right now, we don't have a specified volume of reductions, either in the drought contingency plan or in the shortage guidelines. But one of the things the drought contingency plan does have is that when we see the lake ahead of time, potentially heading towards that outcome, falling below that elevation, and specifically when we see 2 years ahead of time that the lake's falling below 1035, kind of as a canary in the coal mine of that issue, the basin states have agreed to get back together to collaborate to take collective actions to figure out what to do to stop that from happening and actually to protect elevation 1020 in a way that the lake, with everything we could do other than Mother Nature, keeping the lake from going any further below 1020. It's kind of referred to as the backstop language in the drought contingency plan. It was a key component of the plan for the state of Arizona as we negotiated the drought contingency plan.
I think, students, that's a very perceptive question that illustrates a good lesson for all of us that we always try to strive for is always have a backup plan. What if the thing that you're doing doesn't work the way you thought it would? And what about when the thing you're doing is over? What are you going to do next? And we're, as Director Bushowski just said, we're trying to anticipate building that into the plan that we're doing today. I would like to read another question. I'm not going to answer it because we've talked about it a lot today in this room and we have more discussion, but it shows you how perceptive these students are to these issues. What is a higher priority, keeping Lake Mead at a healthy level or distributing water through the Southwest at the same amount promised? How about that? Good question, right? Okay, and this is the last one that we can take today because we do need to leave a little time for other public comment. Should some stakeholders or cities get their water shut off, or should everybody be put on a water limit? So I will take a crack at answering that question. All of the water that's used in Arizona and throughout the Southwest has a priority. And there are different priorities, and some priorities are higher than other priorities. So there is at least a answer for the questions like, well, when there's a shortage, who gets cut first? And we know what the answer to that is, but sometimes we don't like what the answer is. That these people get cut first, or those people get cut first, then those people get cut. That's why we're all meeting here, is to see if there's a way to agree to still respecting how the priorities work, make agreements among ourselves that the outcome might be different than just kind of the default outcome of what the priorities dictate. So I hope that answers that question. It's a very perceptive question. Tom, did you want to add anything? Okay, thanks very much for coming and being part of our process today.
Ted, can I just say something real quick? Can I just add something?
Senator Rotondo.
I would just like to thank the educators who have brought the kids in. Teaching our kids about water conservation, and the drought is extremely important. So a special thank you to the teachers and the school. And kids, if you're interested in law, study water.
Thanks. So now we are at the point in time when we will ask for public comment on the issues we've discussed here today, the presentations, et cetera. So I see Margaret's hand raised. Alan, go ahead, Alan, first, since you're already standing.
Okay. My name is Alan Delaney. I'm Water Policy Administrator for the City of Peoria. I'm here to correct a bit of misinformation that arose during the discussion of mitigation for CAGRID. It was stated that CAGRID is responsible for all of the housing built in the West Valley. That is not true. The City of Peoria in 2009 withdrew as a member service area from the CAGRID and all subdivisions and houses built since that time in Peoria have been without any support from CAGRID. We base our designation of assured water supply on the strength of our water resources portfolio, and we depend on the priority system embedded in that designation. Thank you.
Margaret. It's coming.
I want to make sure I understand slide 3, the new news today. That what you're talking about is the agreement that was reached is that when DCP goes into effect, Arizona will have, in addition to the 200,000 extra 200,000 acre feet extra for ICS, will now have 300,000. Is that what that agreement means?
So instead of having a total of 300,000 with DCP, we will have 600,000.
600,000.
That is
All right.
what that means.
Thank you.
So as long as we're in a clapping mood, how about for that one?
So I do want to say this, and I think Senator Griffin asked for more information. We'll talk, Senator Griffin, about what questions and what more information will help in that regard, but I'll also throw it out to everybody that as you think about this, and I know there's not a lot of meat on the bones of what we just described, but if things come to you in terms of what would be helpful for us to explain more or more questions, send Ted or I the questions, and we'll prep them up for the next either work group meeting, steering committee meeting, or both, so that we can get folks comfortable as much as we can with this new concept.
Just to clarify, too, the point that we made earlier is that the specific loan of this additional 100,000 acre feet to Arizona by California and Nevada is not part of DCP. It'll be part of a side agreement, but the side agreement will be authorized within the DCP for those type of transactions to occur.
Anyone else out there in the public? Seeing none, thank you very much, and bring your protein bars for October 10th.